We've got some big news from Ukraine. I mean, it's increasingly clear that the direction our policy has been pushing is it's not where it's basically a disaster. Let's go ahead and put this first part up on the screen. President Biden now on Wednesday saying the U.S. will deliver another $1 billion worth of military equipment to Ukraine, including weapons to defend the country's coast, additional artillery, and more ammunition for the rocket systems to defend against Russian aggression in the eastern part of the country. Of course, this comes on top of many other billions in weapons that have been sent to Ukraine. It also comes after the reports that, hey, we're sending all these billions of dollars in weapons, and Ukrainians are not telling us what they're doing with the weapon, what their plans are. They are not being candid with us, or even about how things are ultimately going there. So the Biden administration's policy of we want to keep this war going, we don't want to negotiate it, and we want to keep it going because we want to bleed Russia, and we want to punish Putin and maybe push him out of power. Remember Biden saying he cannot remain in power, quote unquote. That has led us to a situation where it's just like, okay, so what are we doing here? Are we just going to continue week after week, billions and billions more, as the situation for Ukraine on the ground is, based on the reports we're seeing, is starting to worsen?
Well, it's not good in Ukraine. So, I mean, look, I really feel for the Ukrainians here because they're in the fight of their lives and they are losing some 200 guys a day. That level of attrition is just brutal. And the Ukrainians say that they have another 1 million guys that they can call up, 2 million in reserve. But you got to remember, some of the reports I'm reading, these guys have like 6 weeks of basic weapons training before they're even sent to the front line. And that's just, it's a mower, like a lawnmower on both sides, really, because you have Russian conscripts who are also dying. We have tens of thousands of deaths now on both sides of this conflict. And I can never say the city. Severodonetsk has been completely encircled. The Ukrainians there are continue to fight, but it's a brutal and a bloody mess. All current indications at the current level of weapons assistance show us that Ukraine can probably keep this going, with Western allied weapons, but perhaps not for long. The terrain actually lends itself to the Russian tactics. And also, Russia has moved its logistics supply from diesel-backed trucks to traditional rail, almost like a Soviet-era tactic, which apparently has been working pretty well for them. It's, also the weather has changed. People forget that. It's not as muddy over there anymore. All of this kind of moves in the Russian higher power direction. I just want to say here, on the European side, we continue to be the people bearing the brunt of all the military aid. Germany, France, all of the NATO allies are not sending even 1/10 the amount of weapons assistance that we are. And in fact, those countries, once again, remember this, the reason that we're supposedly doing this is in defense of our NATO allies where we don't live, are not even close to showing and sharing the burden of the weapons that we're sending over there. In fact, they don't want to keep sending weapons. We're the ones who are telling them to do so. Germany and France are actually pushing for more peace talks in the region. So let's go and put this up there because the diplomatic part of all of this also is very important. Chancellor Schultz is actually visiting Kiev with both Macron and Mario Draghi because they want to meet with Zelensky before the G7 summit. Remember, too, that Russia had long, kicked out of the G8, has long problems with that. But both Schultz and Macron have continued to maintain talks with Putin. And this is starting to see, I think, a break in the Anglosphere and the Western alliance because the Anglosphere, the UK and the US by far both have the most hawkish positions and frankly the most hawkish electorate. Like the UK citizens are much more on board with supporting the war. I would just say here, I don't know if it's all of our citizens, but the most active liberal ones with the Ukraine flags and all those in their front yard, those people are, never going to accept the US pushing any sort of peace deal. So this break in the alliance, it matters because we are still the ones who are basically saying that we need to continue to ship as many weapons over there as possible. And I'm torn here. I don't know. I mean, at the same time, the Ukrainians do want to fight. Like they want to continue fighting. I really think as long as we continue to adhere to our red lines on we're not going to provide you with X type of weapons, I'm generally fine with it. The problem, though, is that Zelensky and the Ukrainian military are actually asking us for even more offensive weapons. And I think that this is exactly the environment which I have worried a lot about the president having the discretionary authority to give whatever type of weapon systems that he wants. Because now is actually probably the best case, right, for political pressure to provide the Ukrainians with the most offensive type of weapons when they're actually losing. Because in the previous, they were winning. But now that they're having to fall back and they're seeing significant possible military defeat on the battlefield, the pressure in Washington is going to mount the other way. Not to say, okay, guys, maybe it's time to go and to have a peace deal. It's actually going to mount the opposite and say, why shouldn't we provide them even more offensive weapons? That's what I'm most worried about.
Right. Well, here's the thing. I don't object to us helping the Ukrainians defend themselves. I truly don't. What I object to is a policy that says, let's keep this war going as long as possible versus let's use our great influence to push these parties to come to the table and negotiate a settlement. Because, you know, I actually don't know what the Ukrainians want, to be perfectly honest with you. I know what our media tells us that they want, but I've also read reports out of especially Eastern Ukraine of people saying, I really don't care whether it's Ukraine or Russia. I just want this ultimately to end. Yeah. So I do think we should be a little bit humble about thinking we know what the Ukrainians want. That's number one. Number two, they're not the only stakeholders in this conflict. And obviously, they have borne the worst of this. I mean, their country is decimated. The losses have been catastrophic. Now they're losing in the east, and there's fears Russia could go and take back some of those cities they had been pushed out before. So this is a horrific landscape for Ukraine as well. But then you look at the impact around the world. First of all, our economic warfare, and I think you're talking about this in your monologue.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's not working.
It's been a disaster. It's been a disaster. It did exactly what we predicted it would do, which is to punish ordinary Russian citizens
and us, actually,
and
our
us,
citizens,
and people around the globe. I mean, you already had a global hunger situation that was really quite dire because of a number of crop failures, in part due to the climate crisis. Now you add this war on top of it in this absolutely critical breadbasket region of the world, and you now have 50 million people facing famine. So the Ukrainian situation is one thing to consider and incredibly vital. And yes, I'm interested in what they want and how they want things to go, but it is not at all the only interest to consider. I care about what happens for the people of the globe, of the world. I care about what happens for our own citizens. Oh, and also, by the way, let's not forget, I also care about avoiding a nuclear war between two nuclear superpowers, which it's easy to forget. That's the threat that hangs over this whole thing. I know it's easy to sort of downplay that threat, especially as we've gotten a few months in now and there haven't been any nukes, so I think you guys were overblowing it. But as we always say, if there's even a 1% chance of nuclear war, I want nothing to do with risking that 1%. So that's my issue with the U.S. policy. It's not that Ukrainians' cause isn't just. It's 100% just. It's not that they don't have a right to defend themselves. They 100% have a right to defend themselves. I'm in support of us supporting them in that endeavor. I am completely opposed to the U.S. and U.K. posture that says, let's bleed the Russians indefinitely. Let's keep the war going indefinitely. We don't want to even talk about or contemplate ceding any territory here whatsoever. We're not going to use our leverage to bring parties to the negotiating table. And I also continue to be opposed to the economic warfare that we have waged on the ordinary Russian citizen, which has had massive blowback on our own people around the globe, and has not hurt Putin at all.
Yeah, and let's just emphasize too, I always say this, look, if you truly believe in supporting the Europeans, listen to what they have to say. So let's throw this on the screen. Macron says, yeah, I want a Ukrainian victory, but ultimately, this will only be settled at the negotiating table. So Germany and France, both countries which have had historic conflicts with Russia, tensions with Russia, actually live near Russia, they want, in order to push this in a peaceful direction. These are also the two leaders within the European Union. We seem to completely ignore that. I'm also getting very worried about the Chinese and Russian PERMA alliance here. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is Xi Jinping actually just called Vladimir Putin, where they put out a joint statement where he said he offered to deepen cooperation with his Russian counterpart. Now look, Chinese weapons have not yet flowed into Russia, but I just want to continue to emphasize we're still in a very, very, very early part of this conflict. It's only been 4 months since it broke out. That's why whenever we were triumphalizing and saying, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It was great when the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of Kiev and they stopped a collapse of the entire country. But the Ukrainians themselves are telling you that if they lose the east, they actually could provide the Russians a staging ground in order to relaunch an invasion. That's how war works. You don't just have one battle. It grinds on for a really long time. You have to consider the will of your enemy. We're probably in the best position if the Ukrainians do lose in the east to try to push for peace in that exact time. And if we don't, and current all indications show us that we're not going to, if you also consider Zelensky's interest, the moment Zelensky tries to go to the negotiating table, the spigot of weapons here turns off, right? The realignment of how exactly we're going to approach the conflict stops, and our diplomatic push in a different direction is not really going to provide him with the political stability necessarily that he needs, because the Ukrainian population wants to still continue fighting, especially those who are in the West. So we just have to know we're in a real mess here. Current indications show us that we're in a complete war of attrition. The European powers want to try and bring this to an end and in some sort of negotiated settlement. By the way, if you think we're suffering, their prices over there are insane on gas and on food, and they are watching their economies erode. You actually could set the stage for major populist backlash in Germany and France in order to try and sue for a type of peace, which, look, you know, you want it now before things get so bad in the West that the West decides we've had enough of this. And I actually really do think that's coming. On the Chinese side as well, reading this, watching a permanent alignment between the two really would be a catastrophe. And I know nobody likes him, but Henry Kissinger actually did say that one of the biggest risks that could come out of this is actually pushing a permanent alignment between the two countries. I read a really interesting column, which I wanted to float here, called A Reverse Kissinger in India, which is that right now, because the US maintains strong ties with India, and India continues to buy Russian oil and actually has very strong ties with Russia, we should really be leaning and trying to have some creative thinking and trying to have a broker role of India or some other semi-neutral-ish type power begin to try and broker a diplomatic solution. If the US could work its way around that, this is what creative thinking in the global system looks like, which could actually benefit our image and also bring an end to the global catastrophe of not only what's happening in Ukraine, but all of the follow-on effects that so much of us are feeling here.
And don't forget that, you know, if you want an indicator of revolution, like bread prices are pretty reliable. Something else that Kissinger pointed to, by the way, that, you know, bread prices definitely linked to, you don't have to go back to the French Revolution. You can look at the Arab Spring and how much price increases there fueled a lot of instability and overthrow and revolution and chaos. And so, you know, there's massive consequences here. I think it's worth underscoring what Xi said after this phone call between China's Xi and Russia's Putin, which they had not talked for quite a while, since basically like around the time that we know of, since like around the time of the invasion. And now Xi said, the readout of the call, China is willing to promote the steady advancement of practical bilateral cooperation. China is willing to continue maintaining mutual support on major issues of mutual concern involving sovereignty and security and other core interests, building closer bilateral strategic cooperation. So this is China and Russia saying, we're all in, you know. Any sort of reservations that maybe China had at the beginning, there were some reports that kind of caught off guard. They were kind of embarrassed by Russia's immediate like failures in this war, while Russia's starting to turn the tide. And China is now saying, don't worry, we're still in with you. We got your back.
Yeah, I think that could be the most significant thing that comes out of this conflict.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.